Hello, I'm Tom Turner and I love Wimbledon Common. Let's begin with some of its notable features. It's a beautiful and wild place, an urban wilderness and a nature reserve. It gives visitors a greater sense of freedom than in a typical public park. Unlike most public parks, Wimbledon Common is fully owned and fully controlled by the commoners, not by the officials of a municipality. The Common is historically important as a place where the local people, the commoners, have had common rights since ancient times. In the 1860s, a fight to protect these rights led to laws which protected many other open spaces from development. The Common has always had a mixture of uses. Formerly, they were common rights, which included collecting firewood and grazing ducks, pigs, and cows. Today, the uses include a happy mix of golfers, horse riders, walkers, cyclists, and lovers. Most golf courses are private enclaves with no public access. Wimbledon's fairways are beautiful glades framed by wildwood and animated by red-shirted golfers. Most golf courses are private enclaves with no public access. Wimbledon's fairways are beautiful glades framed by wildwood and animated by red-shirted golfers, so that walkers notice them. So let's see how these features came about. Common land, like the common law, is one of the glories of England. An old ditty goes like this. "'Tis very bad in man or woman to steal a goose from off the common, but who shall plead that man's excuse who steals the common from the goose?" The land of Wimbledon Common now belongs to local residents. They have both ownership and control. It doesn't belong to a municipal authority and it isn't run by a parks department. But it's well used, well managed, open to all, and funded by a levy on local residents. And it's about as near to an urban wilderness as you can get in an urban area. Cities benefit from diversity in the ownership and management of public open space. Common land is a relic of the feudal system that William the Conqueror established in England after 1066. Claiming ownership of the whole country, he kept 20% of the land for himself and distributed the rest to his barons and to the church. They subdivided the land into manors, whose owners further subdivided it into tofts and crofts, which were held under the feudal system and occupied in return for services to the lord of the manor. As well as the right to build a cottage on the toft and grow food in the croft, his tenants also had rights in areas designated as common land, which covered about half of England. These rights usually included grazing, fishing, and firewood. But the ownership of this land remained with the lords of the manors. So when the feudal system collapsed, they took the opportunity to enclose common land for agriculture, to sell it for development, and to extinguish common rights. Awful. Manorial court records provide some information about the vegetation and use of Wimbledon Common in feudal times. It was also called Wimbledon Heath, with heath meaning open and uncultivated land, usually naturally clothed, with low herbage and dwarf shrubs, often including heathers, which are also called heaths. The lower vegetation was used for grazing, cattle, horses and pigs, which were kept in small enclosures. The scrubland with woody plants was used for firewood, charcoal burning and building. Acorns were used to feed stock, and apples were picked for eating. Only feudal tenants had the right to do this, and they could be fined for taking more than their allotted share. In the mid-19th century, Earl Spencer, who was Lord of the Manors of Wimbledon and Battersea, and an ancestor of Princess Di, wanted to develop the common and offered to use some of the money to make a public park, which he would still have the right to develop. The commoners objected, and in 1871 secured an Act of Parliament to protect their open space. It had, and has, a body of conservators to be constituted so as to represent both public and local interests, whose duty it shall be to keep the commons forever open and unenclosed and unbuilt on, and to protect the turf, gorse, timber and underwood thereon, and to preserve the same for public and local use, for purposes of exercise and recreation. The 1871 Act stopped noblemen stealing rights from commoners and from geese. Other historic uses of the common have included outdoor swimming in the Queensmere, ice skating, army training camps, rifle competitions, horse racing and duelling. William Pitt, when Prime Minister and at war with France, fought a bloodless duel with an MP on the common. Old maps and aerial photographs show how the vegetation has changed. John Roke's 1746 map shows woodland on the lower slopes near the Beverley Brook and most of the common as open heathland. The 1896 Ordnance Survey map shows much the same thing, woodland near the Beverley Brook and open heath on the flat land at the top of the hill. The name Beverley comes from beavers, which became extinct in Britain about 400 years ago. 50 years ago, sewage gave the brook a terrible smell. It's gone, I'm very pleased to say, and the beavers could be reintroduced. After the feudal system ended in 1660, there was less protection for trees, and the common became more open, with large areas of heather and grass. Since 1945, the trees have been regenerating, and they now dominate the common. Detailed information about the historic use of the common can be found in legal and other documents. In the Middle Ages, there were fines for people who keep their pigs unrung, which overturn the pasture of the lord and his tenants to the common injury, and, without license, beat the oaks and collect acorns. In 1464, 60 oaks were cut at one time, with beech, elm and ash also cut. In 1499, a man was fined because he had cut unjustly 2 cartloads of underwood in saplings. In 1528, a man was fined for overburdening the common with his cattle, to the great damage of the inhabitants there. In 1529, a man was fined for gathering and selling so many crab apples that the tenants of the lord cannot have their earlier and most interesting apples growing upon the common. In 1595, a bailiff was charged for unjustly and without license cutting 2 small oaks on the common. In 1867, one of the comments on Lord Spencer's attempt to fence off the common was that what is now more open common with patches of furze and here and there a little brushwood was then more in the nature of a forest. For 31 years after 1859, a large area near the windmill was used by the Norfolk Rifle Association for its competitions. They lasted for a few days and the participants slept in tents. Old illustrations show little vegetation in this area. In the 21st century, the conservators, with volunteer helpers, began cutting back vegetation to keep what remains of the open heathland. The old way of doing this was by grazing. You might think this would now be impossible because of the golf and the pedestrians and because there's no fencing. But grazing has been successfully re-established in Epping Forest. Longhorn cattle are fitted with receivers, which look like cowbells. If a cow approaches the edge of the area defined in a GPS and emits a sound that rises in pitch as a warning and delivers a mild electric pulse if the cow tries to cross the boundary. This works well in Epping and could work in Wimbledon. I'm sure the cattle would be popular. To conclude, let's consider what other open spaces can do to gain some of the blessings Wimbledon Common enjoys by virtue of its own Act of Parliament. The main thing is to involve users. A web presence with a forum is a good start. A friends group is definitely worthwhile, but insufficient. Users should have a right to comment on how budgets are used. They should also be encouraged to help with gardening and other tasks. For big parks, setting up a trust to own and manage the space is the best solution. For all parks, a volunteer landscape architect is a boon.